Hey, it's Matt. I've got a 9 by 12 inch transparent watercolor of a winter-plumed long-billed Dowitcher to share with you today. This one was pretty quick to render, mostly because it had a very sparse background. I usually have a lot more going on in the frame, so there was a lot less detail to work on in this one. I got my photo reference for this painting on a super foggy morning while visiting Black Point Wildlife Drive at Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge in Florida. I was planning on a very light minimalist background in this painting with a quick suggestion of a reflection. I always start with the background, so after transferring my sketch to the block of Kilimanjaro cold pressed paper, I carefully masked off the bird using liquid Frisket. I wanted to have a super smooth gradient, so I pre-wet my paper, making sure it was evenly saturated with no puddles or drying areas. I almost never work on a white background. Typically I'll introduce some color, even if it's just a tint. Starting about a third of the way down the page, I used a 1-inch flat brush to wash in a wide, blurry band of quinacridone magenta with a little bit of dioxazine purple. I stopped about a third of the way from the bottom. This light pinky purple color should accentuate the brown grays of the bird that will come in later in the painting. It will also have a lot more personality than a plain white. It's amazing how even a quick wash like this can begin to establish a suggestion of depth. Once the wash grabbed hold of the paper, I hit it with the hairdryer to lock it in. Next, I started painting in some ripples and reflections in the water. This was done with a No. 2 round brush, applying a glaze, using my background color with some added ultramarine blue. I wasn't trying to get the entire reflection rendered at this point, but I did want to more or less finalize anything touching the bird so I can remove the frisket. More exact details will be brought in later as I am mixing in the bird's colors. Once the basics were in, I removed the liquid frisket. I try to get the frisket off the paper as soon as possible, ideally after an hour or two. If left on too long, it can grab hold of the paper or discolor it. I'll put a link in the video description to a video I made on liquid frisket tips and tricks. With the white of the paper revealed, I transferred my foreground sketch using a folding bone and a tracing paper transfer. Once those landmarks were down, I did a quick wash of shadows to the bird using some of my background pink, dioxazine purple, and phthalo blue. This will establish my basic lighting while adding some unifying colors for down the road. After that, it was a quick pass on the legs with lemon yellow and sap green desaturated with a tiny bit of chrome orange. I carried those colors down into the reflection of the bird. Next, I wanted to start bringing in some of the bird's colors. I started with some of the dark barring on the rump and flanks. These were made with a mix of Indian red, burnt sienna, and phthalo blue. To establish the bird's overall brown-gray tone, I used a passive yellow ochre grayed out with a little bit of my purplish mix. I mixed up more of the burnt sienna and blue mix to render the barring in the bird's reflection. Next, I glazed in some darker parts of the bird's feathers. The beak went in with a green-brown mix made with sap green, Indian red, and yellow ochre. I always tend to slow down when rendering beaks, especially long, thin ones like this one. They have a tendency to get slightly thicker if you move too quickly. I always rotate the page to the direction that matches what's comfortable for my hand and arm. At this point, the basic tones were all in, and it was a matter of glazing in tons of details with many darker layers of paint. After getting some of the feathers darkened, I shifted my attention to defining the bottom edge of the bird to get more separation from the background by darkening it with my blue-purple mix. When using transparent watercolor, I'm gradually darkening my painting as I go, glazing in detail with continually darker, more opaque applications of paint. It's definitely different than if you're painting with acrylics, oils, or pastels where you have the option of getting lighter. But once you get used to the workflow and allowing that white of the paper to shine through, it's really rewarding. I found that I could get faster and more detailed results with watercolor than any other physical medium. Computer-based art is fast and detailed, but just isn't nearly as much fun for me. I went about darkening the back feathers another notch darker. The edges of those feathers are lighter than the interior, so I hit those with another pass of brown-gray. I spent some time adding additional mottled browns to the head and neck. I needed to render some of the brown on the wings in the reflection, so I used my burnt sienna and blue mix to rough in their general position. Afterwards, another glaze of darker browns was added to the wings, back, and eventually the head. The beak had some sharpening and darkening with dark browns. I wanted to add a little color differentiation to the bottom edge of the bird, so I used a light glaze of permanent alizarin crimson to selectively darken areas. Then I added more edge details with some of my purple blues. Similarly, in the reflection, I added that darker edge, as well as some shading to the wing, and adjusted the location of some of the barring. Now is time for yet another pass of glazes to the wings, back, and head. It takes many passes to build up the textures and the depth on all the feathers. Afterwards, I darkened up some of my barring on the rump and flanks. There are a ton of smaller feathers working up the neck and up the head, building up the mottled pattern. Those received tons of overlapping glazes of gray browns using light, short, slightly overlapping brush strokes. After many passes, it starts to have convincing texture and shading. Now that the head was moving along, the back needed some more rounding out and another layer of slightly darker gray browns. I tend to move around the page a lot, working on different sections until things are evenly developed. It may sound a bit crazy, but the painting kind of points out what needs your attention. As you finish a pass in one area, another starts to look a bit unfinished, and you switch to working on that section. Sometimes you want to leave some areas of your paintings less finished, allowing some of the brushwork to show. In this painting, where it's basically a single object, I just worked on it until everything was evenly rendered. I had someone recently ask in the comments of a previous video why I paint all the way to the edge of my watercolor blocks. She noted that it would make it impossible to frame and include the entire area that I had painted. That was a great observation. Occasionally I'll tape up the edges of a block, but typically I only do that if the block had separated from the backing board. Otherwise, I paint to the edges. When I lay out the sketch onto the page, I scan in my drawings from a sketchbook and resize them in Photoshop to get them to fit the painting format. I'm always adding some dead space around the edges that can be matted out for framing, so I account for the lost space. You can see from the edges of this block that the last quarter inch are actually a bit stained from the previous painting's opening washes, so you don't want to plan on including that in the frame. Yes, there are times where I end up painting some edge detail that will get hidden by a matte. Usually it isn't all that much though, so it's okay. Another option is to tape all of your edges. I do that if I'm using single sheets of watercolor paper on a backer board, or if my block's page separates from the backing. Things were getting pretty close to finished after many glazes with increasingly darker details. My reflection, it needed some more details like fixing the barring, darkening the wing, and overall darkening the reflected tones. Late in the painting, I spent a lot of time sharpening up edges and adding many tiny dark shadows. Many of the feathers have little fringes on them that I'll spend time rendering. Crisping up all those edges really adds a ton of interest. I decided that the head and neck needed to have some added contrast to separate them from the background. Adding purple to the browns makes for some great dark colors. I was really trying to balance out the bird and its reflection at this point, so another pass of darker details went into that reflection. I'd switch frequently between working on each section of the painting. Now it was time to add some of the final darks to the bird's back and wing. After that, I spent some time carefully rendering the eye. I switched to a 10-aught brush for many of these tiny details. Eyes always have to be one of the best parts of a painting because they naturally attract a lot of attention. Beaks, legs, and toes also have a lot of fine detail. After working on the eye, I surveyed the painting looking for little details that needed sharpening, some more saturated color, or added contrast. In ways, the opening washes and the final passes might be the most fun of watercolor, but I enjoy the whole process. I eventually ran out of those smaller details to render, or fix, so I signed the painting and called it quits. Although this painting of a winter-plumed long-billed Dowitcher was simplistic in composition, it was great fun to work on. I was really happy with the simple, quiet suggestion of a background with pink and very little other information. It was a bit different than many of my other paintings, so it was a fun change of pace. Thanks for watching. I hope you all get a chance to get out the watercolors and paint soon.